was the kind of rain that stuck to your skin like an accusation, slick and relentless, making the city streets glisten with grime. I watched it drum against the cracked windshield of my old Pontiac, each droplet a faint, muddy reminder of the place I was about to step into. In my line of work, you learn fast that some cases sink their teeth into you before you even touch the doorknob. And this one had a bite. The Montclair Hotel stood a few paces ahead, looming like some forgotten relic of a better past. They'd called it the Pride of the Coast back in the 20s, back when grand staircases and gleaming chandeliers drew in all the well-heeled folks with a nose for luxury. But those days were gone. Now it was just another washed-up spot at the edge of town, propped up on a cliff as though daring the waves below to come and take it. The place had that empty, abandoned look buildings get when even the ghosts give up. 3 people had gone missing here in the last 6 months, each of them last seen wandering through the Montclair's halls. That's what the file said anyway. I'd read it, twice. Kept it close, like a lucky charm, though I knew there was nothing lucky about it. The people who'd vanished were nobodies. A drifter, a young runaway, and an out-of-town tourist who should have known better than to rent a room here. But disappearances don't sit well with local law, not when they come in threes. The chief had called me in for this one, and he didn't bother dressing it up. The Montclair needs to be handled, he'd said. All business. I figured handled was code for something like spooked out of commission. He'd always had a flair for the dramatic, and if I was going to play along, I might as well get paid for it. I lit a cigarette and took a long drag, letting the smoke sit in my lungs as I looked up at the hotel. The windows stared back, dark and lifeless, glass panes fractured like tired eyes. I flicked the cigarette into a puddle and made my way to the entrance, letting the rain soak through the soles of my shoes. The Montclair wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat, but then neither was I. Inside, the place reeked of stale air and something sharper, like the faint tang of iron. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, exposing patches of mold that crept up the walls like silent witnesses. The front desk sat under a thick layer of dust, untouched, with an old ledger splayed open like a half-forgotten story. I stepped closer and brushed my hand across it, feeling the grit under my fingers. Faded ink marked the names of the guests who had come and gone, though most of the lines had long since blurred, as if the hotel itself was trying to forget. But it was the silence that got me, the kind that presses in, making every creak of the floorboard sound like a scream. I'd been in plenty of empty rooms, but this place had a way of hanging on to the quiet, like it had something to prove. It didn't want anyone breaking it. I took a moment, scanning the room, looking for signs of life. Anything that said people had passed through here in the last year. The door behind the front desk was slightly ajar, and a sliver of darkness stretched out like an invitation. I didn't much like the look of it, but I'd learned a long time ago that you don't solve cases by running from shadows. With a steadying breath, I stepped forward, my shoes sinking into the damp carpet with a faint squelch. Each step echoed, bouncing off walls that seemed to pull the sound in, swallowing it whole. The hallway stretched out ahead, dim and murky, with the occasional door hanging open, giving me a glimpse of rooms that hadn't seen company in years. But there was something else, too, something just out of sight. A glistening patch here and there, like someone had left a trail of something viscous, a thick, fleshy residue that stuck to the walls. I'd seen strange things in my line of work, but this wasn't anything I could put a name to. There was a smell, faint but distinct, cloying and metallic, like old pennies left too long in the rain, and I could feel something lurking in it, a sensation just beyond reason, prickling at the back of my neck. My fingers brushed the edge of the nearest door, and I nudged it open with the tip of my shoe, letting it swing in on its own. The room was dark, save for a sliver of light slicing through a crack in the far wall. The bed was covered in dust, the blankets stiff and brittle, as though they'd given up waiting for someone to disturb them. A suitcase lay open on the floor, its contents scattered, crumpled, and forgotten. Someone had been in a hurry to leave. But it was the mirror above the vanity that drew my gaze. It was cracked in 3 places, each fracture radiating out like a spider's web. I stepped closer, peering into the shattered glass, half expecting to see something behind me. But it was just me, my reflection staring back, distorted and fragmented, my face a patchwork of jagged lines. For a moment, I thought I caught a flicker of movement in the shards, something shifting, like a shadow darting behind my shoulder. I spun around, heart steady, eyes sharp, but the room was empty. Just nerves, I told myself. Places like this had a way of getting under your skin. The shadows, the dust, the smell, it all worked on you, slipping into your thoughts, making you see things that weren't there. But I wasn't here to play games with my imagination. I was here to find out what happened to those people, and if the Montclair had any secrets, it was my job to drag them kicking and screaming into the light. I stepped back into the hallway, feeling the air grow thicker, the silence more oppressive. The darkness seemed to pool around me, thick and heavy, like I was walking through molasses. Somewhere down the hall, a door creaked open, the sound stretching out and fading into the gloom. I felt an urge to follow it, an odd compulsion that gnawed at the edges of my mind, tugging me forward, deeper into the Montclair's belly. Every instinct told me to turn back, to get out while I still could. But I couldn't. I'd come this far, and if there was anything waiting for me in that darkness, I'd look it dead in the eyes. It was a fool's errand, maybe. But hell, I'd been called worse. The corridor stretched longer than it should have. I'd seen enough buildings to know when the architecture wasn't adding up, but each step forward seemed to tug me deeper into a space that felt carved out of nowhere. The walls had a sickly sheen to them now, like they'd been painted with something that didn't quite dry, catching the dim light in patches. My shoes squelched still with each step, but sticking a little more than they should to the floor. The place was more than just abandoned. It was as though it had been deliberately left to rot from the inside out. Someone, or something, wanted to make sure this place was forgotten, erased, left to fester until the walls themselves crumbled into dust. But there was something lurking here, some energy twisting through the halls that had kept the Montclair standing. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was something darker. A faint hum drifted from somewhere down the corridor, an odd rhythm that felt misplaced, too alive for this dead space. I followed it, listening as it grew louder, more distinct. A low, pulsing murmur, like 100 whispers layered over one another. Each one faded just as I tried to focus on it, slipping back into a babble of voices too quiet to pin down, too many to ignore. My fingers twitched, grazing the wall, and a clammy residue clung to my skin. I pulled my hand back, wiping it on my coat, but the feeling stuck, leaving a tingling numbness that crawled up my arm. Focus, I told myself, the word swallowed by the heavy air. The hum persisted, drawing me closer to a half-open door at the end of the hallway, light barely spilling from the crack. I pushed it open with the side of my hand, stepping in cautiously, feeling the weight of the quiet press down on me. Inside, the room was shrouded in shadows, the faintest glow seeping through the boarded-up windows. The furniture was minimal. A single bed, its frame rusted and crooked, a dresser caked in dust, and a mirror hanging slightly crooked on the wall. But something else caught my eye. A book splayed open on the floor, its pages warped and brittle. I knelt down to inspect it. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, looping words scrawled in ink that had bled and faded. Notes, hastily written. Observations, dates, times. I ran my thumb over a line that had been circled and underlined in jagged strokes. The mouths keep moving. Don't listen to them. I stood up, the weight of the words lingering in the back of my mind. Mouths wasn't the word I wanted to hear in a place like this, and yet, somehow, it didn't surprise me. There was a strange sensation creeping in, a kind of dark familiarity, like I'd been here before, though I knew I hadn't. This place, whatever it was, whatever it hid, felt like it was drawing from something I didn't want to remember. I backed out of the room, the pulsing hum following me into the hallway, louder now, more insistent. The walls were alive with it, a whispering chorus that seemed to bubble just beneath the surface. I ran my hand along one, half convinced I'd feel something move, something squirming beneath the layers of decaying wallpaper. And then, suddenly, it was there. A patch of wall that pulsed, like a heartbeat, thrumming under my fingertips. I yanked my hand back, staring as a patch of something fleshy and unnatural seemed to push out from behind the wallpaper, stretching until it broke through, like some wound that refused to heal. But it wasn't a wound. It was a mouth. It opened slowly, soundlessly, lips cracked and peeling, revealing teeth that weren't quite human, too sharp, too large, set in strange, uneven rows. It whispered, the sound a faint hiss, like dead leaves scraping over pavement. I tried to make sense of the words, but they slipped past me, intangible, fragments of something forgotten. Welcome, it seemed to say, though the syllables didn't match, each one scraping out of that twisted maw like it had been wrenched from something ancient and unwilling. Welcome back. I stumbled away, the words echoing in my ears, even as they dissolved into a chorus of other whispers from the walls, each one layered over the next. I felt them pressing in, all speaking at once, a suffocating soundscape of fractured sentences and half-formed words, drawing me further into the corridor. Keep it together, I muttered, trying to steady my mind, to hold on to some semblance of control. But the whispers grew louder, an insistent, mocking murmur that seemed to follow me no matter how far I walked, as if the Montclair itself was laughing at me, knowing I was as trapped as the voices that haunted its walls. At the end of the hall, another door waited, darker than the rest. The nameplate was worn, barely legible, but I could make out the faded outline of the word manager. The hum was louder here, pulsing with an intensity that felt almost alive, like a heartbeat thrumming through the wood. Whatever I was looking for, whatever had made the Montclair its hunting ground, it was here, waiting behind that door. I pushed it open, feeling the weight of the silence settle in around me. The room was empty, save for an old desk and a chair that looked like it had been abandoned mid-conversation. Papers lay scattered across the desk, and on top of them was a large leather-bound book, its cover cracked and worn. I crossed the room, every step feeling like I was wading through something thick and unseen. My fingers brushed the book's cover, and the whispers ceased. Dead silence filled the air, thick and suffocating, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I opened the book, its pages yellowed and brittle, each one filled with neat, meticulous handwriting. It read like a ledger, a record of guests, each name carefully written in black ink. Dates were marked beside each entry, some crossed out, some circled. But the last few entries were different. They weren't names at all, just descriptions. The man with the scar, the woman with the red coat, the boy who sings. Each description was followed by a date, none of them more than a few months old. The last entry was barely visible, scrawled hastily across the bottom of the page. It wasn't a description. It was a warning. They're in the walls. The words seemed to vibrate on the page, a chill sinking into my bones as I read them over and over, trying to make sense of their meaning. But deep down, I already knew. The whispers, the mouths, the strange, pulsing flesh that seemed to breathe behind the wallpaper. It all pointed to something beyond my understanding, something that had burrowed into the Montclair's walls, festering like a parasite. I closed the book, the whispers starting up again, louder this time, like they'd been waiting for me to finish. I could feel them crawling closer, pressing in on all sides, each one a voice that had been swallowed by the hotel, trapped in its walls. And now they wanted me too. I let the book fall shut, its brittle pages snapping together with a sound that echoed far longer than it should have in the silence of the room. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They'd become something more insistent, a feverish chant that scratched at the back of my mind, pushing and pulling, coaxing me forward. I left the manager's office, retracing my steps down the hall, but the hotel didn't seem content to let me go. Every shadow seemed sharper, every corner darker. Doors that had been closed stood wide open, revealing rooms that hadn't seen light in years, their insides festering with mildew, damp carpet, and something slick and shimmering, pooling at the baseboards. My footsteps echoed as I moved, a slow, rhythmic beat that fell in time with the pulsing hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't a beat so much as a pulse, a vibration that ran through the walls, the floor, even the very air. And the walls. God, the walls were covered in something that glistened and oozed, like fresh wounds trying to close themselves. I stopped, pressing a hand to the nearest patch of wallpaper, feeling the dampness seep through my fingers. It was warm, almost feverish, like the skin of a dying animal. I pulled my hand back, only to watch as a mouth began to form in the wall where my hand had touched. It started as a small slit, but quickly widened, splitting open to reveal a row of crooked teeth and lips that cracked and bled as they moved.
You belong,
it whispered, the words slurred and broken, each syllable stretching out, as if the voice hadn't spoken in years.
You belong here.
I stepped back, feeling a tightness in my chest, an instinct telling me to turn and run. But I couldn't leave, not yet. I'd come here for answers, and whatever this place was, it was finally giving me something close to the truth, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. I moved down the hall, the mouths multiplying as I passed, each one whispering, some laughing, others moaning in a way that turned my stomach. They stretched and yawned, each one a different shape, a different voice. Some of them looked human, almost, but others were monstrous. Lips pulled back to reveal black gums, jagged rows of teeth, and tongues that flicked out and twisted in grotesque ways. I reached the staircase at the end of the hall and took it down, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew thick, stale, filled with that sickly sweet smell I couldn't place, like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. The whispers faded, replaced by a low, grinding sound, a deep, guttural noise that seemed to come from the very foundations of the hotel. The basement. Every building had one, and every investigator knew that's where the real stories hid. I pushed open the door at the bottom of the stairs, the hinges groaning like they were fighting me, and stepped into the darkness. The basement was vast, stretching out farther than the building's footprint should have allowed. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of shelves lined with decaying boxes, old furniture draped in dusty sheets, and shadows that seemed to move just out of reach. And then I saw it. A trail of something dark and wet, leading deeper into the basement, disappearing around a corner. I followed it, each step careful, deliberate, but I could feel my pulse quicken, an unnatural pull urging me forward. The trail led to a doorway, a heavy metal door set into the stone wall, rusted and marked with scratches, as though something had tried to claw its way in or out. I reached for the handle, feeling the cold metal bite into my skin, and pulled. The door swung open, revealing a room that looked more like a shrine than anything else. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one shattered, fragments littering the floor, catching the light in jagged patterns. But it was the centerpiece that drew my attention. A figure, propped up in the center of the room, covered in a tapestry of flesh, a patchwork of faces and limbs sewn together in a grotesque mockery of life. Its eyes, what was left of them, were stitched shut, but the mouths moved, each one whispering in a language that scratched at the back of my mind. They seemed to chant, a rhythmic pattern that made my skin crawl, each voice layering over the next, creating a sound that was almost musical, if music could rot. The figure's torso heaved, as though trying to breathe, the mouths gasping, sighing, each breath rattling through it like the last gasp of a dying man. And then, in a voice that didn't come from any one mouth, but from all of them at once, it spoke.
You belong here,
it said, the words echoing through the room, bouncing off the mirrors, distorting and twisting until they became something almost unrecognizable.
We all belong here.
I took a step back, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me, even though its eyes were shut. The mouths continued to move, each one telling its own story, each one a fragment of a life that had been swallowed whole by this place. The Montclair hadn't just taken lives, it had consumed them, absorbed them, twisted them into something monstrous, something that lived and breathed within its walls. I felt the pull, a deep, magnetic tug that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, even the air itself. It wanted me, just as it had wanted them. I could feel it, wrapping around me, slipping into my skin, filling my lungs with that thick, cloying smell. I turned, stumbling back toward the door, feeling the walls close in around me, the whispers following me, louder now, each voice screaming, laughing, pleading. I pushed through the door, slamming it shut behind me, the sound echoing through the basement like a gunshot. But the voices didn't stop. They followed me up the stairs, spilling out from the walls, the floors, each one telling me I belonged, that I was part of them now, that I would never leave. I reached the lobby, my hand gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles went white. The hotel was alive around me, the walls pulsing, breathing, each mouth laughing, taunting, calling me back. I forced myself forward, through the lobby, toward the door, feeling the weight of the building pressing down on me, as though it knew I was trying to escape. The mouths on the walls twisted and writhed, each one a face I thought I recognized, each one a person who had vanished, lost to the Montclair's twisted hunger. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle, pulling it open, feeling the cool night air wash over me like a slap to the face. I made it outside, falling to my knees, the voices still echoing in my ears, their whispers fading as I put distance between myself and the Montclair. As I looked back, I could see the faces pressed against the windows, mouths open in silent screams, watching me, waiting for me to come back. And I knew, deep down, that the Montclair wouldn't let me go. Not really. It had marked me, left its impression buried deep, a whisper in the back of my mind that would follow me wherever I went, calling me back to the place where I would always belong. I didn't go home that night. I didn't go anywhere. I sat in my car, rain drumming against the roof, my hands gripping the wheel hard enough to make the leather groan under my fingers. My mind wouldn't quiet down, no matter how long I stared through the windshield at the twisted silhouette of the Montclair against the night sky. The voices had faded when I left the building, but they still lingered, an echo at the edges of my mind. The image of those mouths, dozens of them, mouths that weren't meant to speak but did, each one whispering, moaning, begging, kept creeping back. And the faces. They'd been twisted, but I'd recognize them. One face after another, each a person who had been swallowed whole by that cursed place. I'd walked away, but I wasn't free. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Morning came. The sky overcast, pale and gray. The Montclair stood there as though nothing had happened, its worn exterior blending with the dreariness of the day. I wasn't ready to leave, couldn't shake the feeling that the case wasn't over. Not really. But going back in there felt like a death sentence. The town was slow to stir, wrapped in a quiet that clung to the cold drizzle hanging thick in the air. Most folks were still holed up in their beds, hiding from the damp chill that soaked into every corner. I needed something to ground me, something warmer than the wheel I'd been gripping too tight, so I steered toward a diner on the edge of town. Its neon lights sputtered against the fogged-up windows, struggling to hold on like they were on the losing side of a long, worn-out battle. The waitress gave me a nod, pouring my coffee before I could ask. She had one of those faces that looked carved from stone, hard and unyielding, but kind in her own way. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice carrying a weary familiarity. "Something like that," I muttered, my voice rougher than I'd intended. I tried to take a sip, but the coffee just sat there, steaming, untouched. I could still feel that sickly sweet smell in my nostrils, that metallic edge that clung to everything inside the Montclair. It didn't belong here, didn't belong anywhere outside those walls. "You were up there, weren't you?" the waitress asked, her voice low, cautious, like she was testing the waters. I glanced up, surprised. "You know the place?" "Everyone in town knows the Montclair," she replied, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Most of us keep our distance, though. I've seen too many people go in and not come out." She paused, her eyes scanning my face like she was looking for something. "But I guess you know that by now." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. "You ever heard anything about, I don't know, voices or people trapped there?" The waitress's face darkened, and she leaned in, her voice barely a murmur. "They say the walls up there are alive, that the place eats people, takes them in, bit by bit, until there's nothing left." Her hand tightened around the coffee pot, her knuckles white. "They say it's been happening for years, but no one ever does anything. Folks in charge just look the other way, pretend it's just a story." She set the coffee pot down, staring into her own cup like it might hold some kind of answer. "My brother went up there once, years ago," she said. "He was young, thought he'd seen a girl in one of the windows, someone who needed help. He went in, and..." Her voice trailed off, her eyes distant. "He never came out." I took a long breath, letting her words sink in. There was a name in her story, a face she'd lost to that building, just like the faces I'd seen pressed against the windows. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. She nodded, a sad smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Ain't your fault. The Montclair's been taking people longer than you or I have been around." She straightened, pulling herself back to reality. "Be careful, you hear? That place, it doesn't let go." I paid for my coffee, left a tip on the counter, and walked out into the cold drizzle, her words echoing in my head. She was right. The Montclair didn't let go. Not really. I stood there in the parking lot, staring up at the hotel's silhouette in the distance. I could feel it, even from here, a low, dark hum that seemed to resonate in my bones, pulling me back. Part of me wanted to drive away, to leave this town and never look back. But there was something else, something deeper, clawing at the back of my mind, a whisper that wouldn't fade. I got back in the car and drove, each turn taking me closer to the Montclair, closer to the darkness that waited there. I didn't know what I was looking for, what I hoped to find, but I knew I couldn't walk away. Not yet. The Montclair loomed larger as I parked and walked up to the entrance, the front door gaping open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The lobby was just as I'd left it, silent and still, dust hanging in the air like ghosts. I moved deeper into the building, my footsteps quiet, measured, as though I were trying not to disturb something that might wake. The walls seemed to breathe around me, the whispers starting up again, faint but persistent, a low murmur that grew louder with every step. I could feel the weight of the hotel pressing down on me, each room heavy with the memories it had stolen, the lives it had consumed. I made my way to the basement door, the metal handle cold under my fingers. I hesitated, the memory of that patchwork figure lingering in my mind, but the whispers urged me on, relentless, insistent. I opened the door and stepped into the darkness, feeling the air grow colder, thicker, like it was filled with something I couldn't see. The basement stretched out before me, a maze of shadows and half-formed shapes. I followed the path I'd taken before, the trail of dark, sticky residue leading me back to the door with the rusted handle. This time, it felt different, heavier somehow. I pulled the door open and stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, the mirrors catching my reflection in fractured pieces. The figure was still there, its patchwork body slumped in the center of the room, its mouths moving in a silent chant. I stepped closer, feeling the pull of its gaze, the weight of its presence pressing down on me. And then, one of the mouths opened, wider than the rest, a gaping hole that seemed to stretch and shift, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. It spoke, its voice a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once.
You came back.
It said, the words dripping with a dark satisfaction. I took a step back, feeling the pull of its voice, the weight of its gaze. But I didn't leave. I couldn't. I stood there, staring into the darkness, the voices growing louder, each one pulling me closer, binding me to this place, to the Montclair and the lives it had taken. And in that moment, I knew I would never truly leave, not while the Montclair held me. I don't know how long I stood there, facing the grotesque figure in the basement room. Time didn't work right in the Montclair. Every minute felt stretched, distorted, like the hotel was bending reality to keep me in its grip. The patchwork figure sat hunched and quiet, its many mouths moving in twisted, silent whispers, each mouth murmuring a different story, a different sorrow. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing down like it wanted to seep into my skin. Each breath came heavier, carrying the scent of rot and something sweeter, cloying, a smell that wrapped itself around my senses, weighing me down. I could feel something sinking into my chest, a cold, creeping dread that I knew was coming from the hotel itself. The voice echoed from the figure, the words rippling through the room, bouncing off the mirrors and twisting in the silence. I backed away, my fingers grazing the wall, searching for something to hold on to, something real in a space that felt like it was closing in. But my hand met only the cold, damp surface of the stone, slippery and unforgiving. The figure's voice grew louder, joined by others, voices I recognized, voices I didn't, each one layering over the next, creating a cacophony of whispers that filled the room. The faces in the mirrors stared back at me, my own reflection fractured, multiplied, distorted into dozens of versions of myself, each one staring with the same look of dread. I realized then that I wasn't alone. The hotel was filled with others who had come before me, others who hadn't made it out. Their reflections flickered in and out, ghostly forms in the cracked mirrors, each one a shadow of a person who had been swallowed by the Montclair. I wanted to scream, to run, to break free of this place. But the Montclair held me tight, each whisper, each fractured face a reminder that I was trapped, bound to it as surely as the others. The mirrors reflected them all, twisted figures, some familiar, others unrecognizable, all of them trapped in the glass, staring at me, waiting for me to join them. The patchwork figure lurched forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, a marionette held together by threads of flesh. Its mouths stretched wider, their voices layering over one another, creating a discordant hum that vibrated through the room. And then, with a sickening crack, it extended one of its arms, the stitched-together skin stretching, pulling tight, as it reached for me.
Stay with us,
it hissed, its many voices merging into a single insistent plea.
become part of the Montclair.
I stepped back, feeling the cold press of the wall behind me, my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing through the silence. The faces in the mirrors leaned closer, their expressions twisted into masks of horror and despair, their mouths moving in sync with the patchwork figure, whispering the same words, the same plea.
Stay with us.
I clenched my fists, feeling a surge of anger, a defiance I hadn't known I possessed. I wouldn't let this place take me. I wouldn't let the Montclair pull me into its twisted web of shadows and whispers. I pushed myself off the wall, forcing my feet to move, breaking away from the figure in the mirrors, each step a fight against the weight that seemed to hold me in place. The whispers grew louder, angry now, insistent, each one a clawed hand reaching out, trying to pull me back. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening, pressing down on me as I pushed through the door, slamming it shut behind me. I could still hear them, the voices, the whispers, muffled but relentless, echoing through the walls, calling me back. I forced myself up the stairs, my footsteps heavy, my breath coming in gasps. The Montclair wasn't letting go. Every step felt like I was wading through molasses, each movement a battle against the invisible pull that seemed to drag me back toward the basement, toward the figure, toward the faces in the mirrors. But I kept going, forcing myself forward, up through the dimly lit corridors, past the peeling wallpaper and the doors that seemed to watch me with silent malice. The walls pulsed around me, each patch of flesh-like growth a reminder of the hotel's twisted hunger, each mouth a symbol of the lives it had consumed. I reached the lobby, the open door a sliver of light in the darkness, a beacon of freedom that felt impossibly far away. The voices followed me, a whispering chorus that grew louder, angrier, each word a command, a demand for me to stay, to return, to join them. But I didn't stop. I pushed forward, the sound of the whispers fading as I stepped through the door and into the open air. The night was still, the rain a soft drizzle that washed over me, cold and biting, letting me feel that I was alive, that I had escaped. My legs were shaky, my mind a blur of terror and relief. The Montclair loomed behind me, silent and watchful, its windows dark, its walls pulsing with a hunger that I could still feel, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I'd escaped, but I knew, deep down, that the Montclair hadn't let me go. It had left its mark, a whisper in the back of my mind, a shadow that would follow me. I stumbled my way to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, my mind racing with images of the patchwork figure, of the faces in the mirrors, of the voices that had whispered my name, calling me back. I started the engine, my hands gripping the wheel, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look back. But as I drove away, I could still feel it, the pull of the Montclair, a dark, insistent tug that seemed to reach out, stretching across the distance, following me, haunting me. The whispers faded, but the memory of them lingered, a weight that pressed down on my chest, a reminder that I was marked, bound to the Montclair in a way I couldn't escape. I didn't stop driving. I left the town behind, the Montclair a distant silhouette in my rearview mirror. But I knew it wasn't over. The hotel was a part of me now, its voices a shadow that would follow me, its faces a reminder of the lives it had claimed. I could still see them, the twisted figures, the mouths that whispered and moaned, each one a fragment of a life that had been swallowed whole. And as I drove, I could still hear the voices, faint but insistent, a whisper that echoed in the back of my mind, calling me back to the Montclair, to the shadows and the whispers, to the twisted, hungry darkness that waited within its walls. Days passed, but the Montclair never left me. I could have been miles away, in a different town, under a bright midday sun, and still I'd feel it, a cold, creeping sensation, like fingers brushing the back of my neck. I'd catch glimpses of faces in mirrors, whispers just at the edge of hearing, names I didn't recognize but somehow knew. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw those mouths, moving, laughing, pleading, locked into expressions that told stories I could never understand. I spent most nights in small motels, their bland decor and fluorescent lights a hollow comfort. The faces appeared less frequently now, just faint, ghostly reflections in windows, in the side view mirror of my car, in the metallic sheen of the coffee pot in some roadside diner. Each time, the expressions were the same, a mixture of fear and pleading, like they were asking me for something I could never give. But the worst part was the feeling, the pull that tugged at my thoughts whenever I was alone, urging me back to the Montclair. I tried to ignore it, tried to drown it out with music, with static, with anything that could fill the silence. But it was always there, lurking, waiting. It was like the Montclair had left a part of itself inside me, a dark seed that rooted deeper every day, spreading its tendrils through my mind, my memories, my dreams. One night, about a week after I'd left, I stopped in a small town just off the highway. I didn't remember the name, didn't even notice the road I'd taken to get there. The motel was cheap, its sign missing a few letters, the paint peeling off in large flakes. I checked in, nodded to the clerk who barely looked up from his magazine, and walked to my room, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead creating a familiar, numbing buzz. Inside, I dropped my bag on the bed, sat down, and stared at the blank beige wall in front of me. The room was quiet, too quiet. It was the kind of silence that settled over me like a weight, pressing down, sinking into my bones. And then I felt it, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration in the air, like a heartbeat. I turned, my eyes drawn to the mirror on the wall. It was a cheap, plain thing, slightly fogged, the frame cracked. But as I stared, I saw it. A face, just behind my own reflection. Faint, almost transparent. It was a woman's face, her expression twisted, her mouth open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The face disappeared, but I could still feel it, that presence lingering. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a leftover nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. The Montclair hadn't let me go. It had followed me, its darkness seeping into every part of my life, haunting me with the faces of those it had taken. I tried to fight it, to shake the feeling that lingered. But each day made it clearer. The Montclair had rooted itself deep in my mind, a parasite I couldn't cut out. No amount of whiskey could block the voices in my ears, their whispers seeping through every empty glass, twisting around every attempt at silence. They clung to me, slipping through the haze, haunting each slow-burning sip, each night that bled into the next. The Montclair's ghosts were buried deep, and no bottle held enough oblivion to drown them out. After months of sleepless nights and hollow days, I made a decision. If the Montclair wanted me, then I would go back. But this time, I wouldn't leave it standing. The hotel had swallowed enough lives, twisted enough souls. It was time for it to burn. I loaded the trunk with everything I'd need: gasoline cans, matches, a sturdy flashlight, and drove back, the road disappearing beneath me as if on autopilot. I didn't hesitate, didn't give myself a chance to second guess. The Montclair would be reduced to ashes. And with it, I hoped, the shadows that had wormed their way into my life would finally be gone. I parked in front of the hotel, staring up at its darkened windows, feeling the familiar pull, that insistent, unsettling sensation that the building was alive. The Montclair stood silent and still, its doors open, its walls pulsing with the strange rhythm I knew too well. But this time, I felt nothing but a grim determination. This was the end. Stepping out of the car, I gripped the gasoline cans tightly, walked up the steps, and entered the hotel. The silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating, as I moved deeper inside. Whispers began again, faint at first, but I ignored them, each step steady, each movement deliberate. I started in the lobby, pouring gasoline over the cracked floorboards, letting it seep into the walls, into every crevice. The walls pulsed with a strange, sickly rhythm, but I kept going, working through each hallway, each room, until the entire first floor was saturated. I knew I needed to reach the basement, the heart of the Montclair's darkness. The air grew heavier as I descended the stairs, each step dragging as though the hotel itself was trying to slow me down. But I kept moving, pulling open the door to the basement with a sharp yank, the hinges groaning in protest. There it was, the room with the patchwork figure, its many mouths moving in silent chants, the hum of its voices echoing in the space. It sensed what I was about to do. The whispers grew louder, filling my head with pleas, with threats, each voice layering over the next, but I didn't stop. I poured the last of the gasoline over the floor, letting it pool around the grotesque figure. It writhed, twisting and contorting, its mouth stretching into sneers, baring its jagged teeth.
You think this will end?
It rasped, the voices merging into a single mocking tone.
You belong to us.
But I struck the match anyway, watching the small flame flicker, then fall from my hand onto the gasoline-soaked floor. Flames erupted, bright and fierce, consuming everything in their path. The figure shrieked, its many voices rising in a horrific wail as the fire spread, licking up the walls, filling the room with thick, acrid smoke. I staggered back, fighting the urge to cover my ears, to drown out the agonized screams that filled the air, each one an echo of the souls the Montclair had claimed. I ran, making my way up the stairs as the fire roared behind me, the building groaning, creaking, as though it were alive and writhing in pain. The walls around me pulsed and shuddered, but I didn't stop, didn't look back. I reached the lobby, the flames already creeping up the walls, devouring the wallpaper, filling the air with the smell of smoke and burnt wood. I burst through the front doors and staggered down the steps, falling to my knees on the gravel, gasping for air as the heat rolled over me. The Montclair stood behind me, a towering inferno, flames consuming every floor, every wall, every twisted secret it had held. I watched as the windows shattered one by one, each explosion a release of the darkness trapped inside. As the roof collapsed, the screams faded, replaced by the roar of the fire, a sound that drowned out everything else, burning away the whispers, the faces, the dark hold the Montclair had kept on me. And then, finally, silence. I stayed until morning, watching the flames die down to embers, the Montclair reduced to nothing more than ashes and smoke. The shadows, the faces, all of it was gone, erased in the fire. I felt the weight lift, a lightness I hadn't felt in months. Was it over? I thought to myself. I drove my car out, gripping the wheel with both hands, as I steered away from the smoldering ruins of the Montclair. The road stretched dark and empty, headlights slicing through the fog that clung to the town's outskirts. Each mile put more distance between me and that place. Familiar landmarks blurred, and the town faded in the rearview mirror, leaving only the lonely highway and the steady hum of the engine. In the weeks that followed, the nightmares stopped. The faces no longer appeared in mirrors. The whispers no longer haunted me in the silence. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I'd left the Montclair behind. It was nothing more than a memory now, a nightmare that had burned away with the last embers of its twisted structure.